There's an unwritten rule in aviation. The captain is always right. But what if the captain is wrong, and everyone in the cockpit is afraid to say so? That's where the accidents that change everything happen. Not because of engine failures or storms, but because of something far more dangerous: human ego. If you're interested in aviation, subscribe to the channel and support us by commenting and liking. Let's get started. Garuda Indonesia Flight 200 departed Jakarta just after 6 in the morning on March 7, 2007, bound for Yogyakarta. It was a routine domestic hop of about an hour, operated by a Boeing 737 carrying 133 passengers and 7 crew members. Among the passengers were a group of Australian journalists and government officials traveling to a diplomatic meeting. In the cockpit sat Captain Muhammad Komar, 44 years old, a 21-year veteran of Garuda Indonesia with over 13,000 flight hours. His first officer was Gagam Romana, 30 years old, with roughly 1,500 hours total. As they began their descent, air traffic control cleared them for a visual approach to runway. The captain acknowledged the clearance but continued setting up for an instrument approach instead. He never told the controller. Then the problems began. When the aircraft was about 10 miles from the runway, it should have been at 2,500 feet. Instead, it was at nearly 4,000 feet, almost 1,500 feet too high. The captain had a choice: either enter a holding pattern and set up for a proper approach, or push the aircraft down aggressively to make the runway. He chose to push. What followed was an approach that violated nearly every principle of safe flying. The captain pitched the nose down steeply, and the airspeed began climbing rapidly. It passed 200 knots. Then 220, then 240. The normal approach speed for this aircraft was around 140 knots. First Officer Romana watched the numbers climb and made a decision that probably saved lives. He refused to extend the wing flaps beyond 5 degrees. The captain had requested 15 degrees, but at these speeds, extending the flaps further could have caused structural failure. The first officer quietly disobeyed, knowing that the flaps were not designed to operate at such extreme velocities. First Officer Romana added his own voice to the warnings, calling for a go-around. The captain did not respond. He did not acknowledge the warnings. He did not reduce power or raise the nose. He simply continued flying toward the runway at twice the normal speed. At 7 minutes before 7 in the morning, the Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at 232 knots, conditions that made a safe landing physically impossible. The aircraft slammed onto the pavement 860 meters beyond the normal touchdown point, still traveling at 221 knots. It bounced violently. First Officer Romana called for a go-around one more time. The captain again ignored him. According to testimony given later, Romana then lost consciousness due to the severe forces acting on his body. The aircraft could not stop. It was traveling far too fast, and there was not enough runway remaining. The Boeing overran the end of the pavement, crashed through the perimeter fence, crossed a public road, and came to rest in a rice paddy 250 meters beyond the runway. The impact collapsed the nose gear, and jet fuel spilled across the wreckage. Within moments, fire erupted. Most passengers were able to escape through emergency exits, but the airport's fire and rescue services were not prepared. Their vehicles could not reach the crash site quickly, and some lacked the proper fire suppressant chemicals. 20 passengers and 1 flight attendant died, most of them from the post-crash fire rather than the impact itself. The investigation found no mechanical failure, no technical excuse. The captain had simply refused to abandon an unstable approach. He ignored 15 separate warnings from the aircraft's safety systems. He ignored 2 explicit go-around calls from his first officer. When asked why he had not aborted, Captain Komar offered no coherent explanation. Investigators noted something else. Just 6 days before the accident, Garuda Indonesia had implemented a new fuel efficiency bonus program. Pilots who burned less fuel than expected would receive extra pay. A go-around burns fuel. Captain Komar denied that the incentive influenced his decision, but investigators included it in their report as a potential contributing factor. Captain Komar was arrested in February 2008 and charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison, though the conviction was later overturned on appeal. The crash triggered the European Union to ban all Indonesian airlines from its airspace, a humiliation that forced Garuda to undertake sweeping safety reforms. Today, the airline holds a 5-star rating and an excellent safety record. But that transformation came at a cost of 21 lives, because one captain could not accept that his approach had failed. On the afternoon of January 13, 1982, Washington National Airport was fighting a losing battle against nature. A massive snowstorm had buried the U.S. Capitol, clogging bridges and freezing the Potomac River solid. Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737 bound for the warm skies of Fort Lauderdale, sat at the gate for hours, accumulating snow and ice, while the airport struggled to keep a single runway open. Inside the cockpit were two pilots who were out of their element. The captain, 34 years old, and the first officer, 31, had learned to fly in the American South. They had thousands of flight hours between them, but very little experience dealing with a severe winter storm like this. As the delays stretched on, the crew made a series of choices that slowly eroded their safety margin. After being de-iced, they sat on the ground too long, allowing the protective fluid to fail as snow continued to fall. Trying to be efficient, they taxied too close to the jet in front of them, hoping the exhaust heat would melt the snow on their wings. Instead, it likely blew a slushy mixture onto the leading edges that would soon refreeze into a deadly, rough layer of ice. When they finally reached the runway, the captain decided not to return for a second de-icing. He chose to go. But the most critical error had happened inside the cockpit. They had failed to turn on the engine anti-ice system. As the Boeing 737 lined up on runway, the engine's pressure probes were already blocked by ice. When the captain advanced the throttles for takeoff, the cockpit instruments, specifically the engine pressure ratio, lied to the crew. The gauges showed that the engines were at full takeoff power. In reality, the engines were barely producing enough thrust to move the airplane. The first officer noticed it immediately. As the plane rolled down the slushy runway, he looked at the engine instruments, and then at the speed. Something didn't feel right. He mentioned that the readings looked a little low, and that the power doesn't seem right. It was a perfect opportunity to abort the takeoff. There was plenty of runway left to stop, but the captain, trusting the false reading on the gauges over the intuition of his co-pilot, dismissed the concern. He continued the takeoff. The aircraft lifted off the ground, but it wasn't really flying. It was staggering, heavy with ice on the wings and producing far less power than the crew believed. The plane was shaking, fighting to stay in the air. Instead of lowering the nose to gain speed, the crew tried to maintain their climb, pulling the aircraft deeper into the stall. The 737 pitched up, shuddered, and fell from the sky. Less than a mile from the end of the runway, Flight 90 slammed into the 14th Street Bridge, which was packed with commuter traffic in the snowstorm. The aircraft crushed 7 cars and trucks, tearing away a section of the bridge before plunging into the freezing, ice-covered Potomac River below. The silence that followed was broken only by sirens. 74 people on the plane and 4 people on the bridge were killed instantly. Only 5 passengers and 1 flight attendant survived the crash, finding themselves clinging to the broken tail section in the freezing water. In a display of incredible heroism, bystanders on the shore jumped into the icy river to save strangers before rescue helicopters arrived. The investigation revealed a tragedy of false confidence. The engines were working perfectly, but the blocked sensors had tricked the crew into using too little power. The ice on the wings had destroyed the lift. Flight 90 had tried to leave Washington relying on instruments that were frozen, and a wing that was never clean enough to fly. 2 Boeing 747 jumbo jets, 1 small airport, 0 visibility. On March 27, 1977, a bomb at Las Palmas forced dozens of aircraft to divert to Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife, a regional field never designed to handle wide-body jets. The ramp was overcrowded, taxiways were blocked, and fog was rolling in fast. One of those 747s belonged to KLM, the Dutch national airline. In the left seat was Captain Jacob van Zanten, not just any captain, but the face of KLM. He appeared in the company's advertisements. He was the head of flight training. He was the man who certified other pilots to fly the 747. Both aircraft were full of passengers, most of them tourists waiting to continue to Las Palmas once the airport reopened. When Las Palmas finally cleared for arrivals, both crews prepared to leave Tenerife. But the fog had thickened. Visibility dropped to less than 500 meters in some areas. The airport had no ground radar, so controllers could not see where the aircraft were on the surface. Everything depended on radio calls and position reports. Because the taxiways were blocked, air traffic control instructed both aircraft to taxi down the main runway itself. The KLM would go first, taxi to the end, turn around, and hold for takeoff clearance. The Pan Am would follow behind on the same runway, then exit onto a taxiway before the KLM began its takeoff roll. It was an unusual procedure, but the only option available given the congestion. The KLM reached the end of the runway, made a 180-degree turn, and lined up for departure. The Pan Am was still on the runway, taxiing slowly through the fog, looking for the correct exit. Neither crew could see the other. The tower could not see either of them. Then something happened that would change aviation forever. Captain Van Zanten released the brakes and advanced the throttles. The KLM 747 began to move forward. The first officer, Klaus Meurs, immediately spoke up. "Wait, we don't have ATC clearance." Van Zanten pulled the throttles back and replied, "No, I know that. Go ahead. Ask." Meurs requested the route clearance from the tower. The controller read back the departure instructions, the route they would fly after takeoff, but did not give takeoff clearance. Moore read it back, and at the end added, "We are now at takeoff." The phrasing was ambiguous. The tower understood it as, "We are now at takeoff position." Van Zanten understood it as confirmation to go. He released the brakes again. The 747 began rolling. In the cockpit, flight engineer Willem Schroeder heard something on the radio that concerned him. The tower had told the Pan Am to report when runway clear. That meant the Pan Am was still on the runway. Schroeder spoke up. "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" Van Zanten replied firmly, "Oh yes." Meurs said nothing more. The KLM was accelerating through 140 knots when the Pan Am finally appeared out of the fog, directly ahead. The Pan Am captain saw the landing lights of the KLM coming toward him and pushed the throttles forward, trying to turn off the runway. The KLM crew pulled back on the yoke, trying to rotate early and fly over the obstacle. It was too late for both. The KLM's nose lifted, but the main gear and the lower fuselage struck the Pan Am just behind the wing. The impact tore the Pan Am apart and sent the KLM into the air momentarily before it crashed back onto the runway and exploded. 583 people died, everyone on the KLM, most of the passengers on the Pan Am. It remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. Investigators found that the KLM captain took off without clearance. The first officer and flight engineer both sensed something was wrong, but neither challenged the captain directly. The official report pointed to communication failures, fog, and airport congestion. But underneath all of that was something harder to write in a report. The captain was too important to question. His reputation, his authority, his confidence created a wall that the other crew members could not break through, even when lives depended on it. After Tenerife, the industry changed. Airlines developed crew resource management training, designed to teach crews that rank does not equal infallibility, and that the first officer's job is not just to assist the captain. But none of that brought back the 583 people who died on a foggy runway because no one could say stop to the most respected captain in the company. United Airlines Flight 173 left Denver for Portland on December 28, 1978, as an evening DC-8 service at the end of the holiday rush. The route was routine, the airplane was familiar, and the weather in Oregon was cold but flyable. For most of the flight westbound, everything was normal. It was only in the last half hour, descending toward Portland, that a minor problem with the landing gear and a major problem with cockpit leadership combined to push a perfectly good airplane all the way from no issue to no fuel. The captain was in his early 50s, with well over 20,000 hours, many of them on the DC-8. He had a strong reputation inside the company, and a natural authority that came with his age and experience. His first officer and flight engineer were significantly younger and far less senior. On the way down into Portland, the crew selected gear down. Instead of the usual smooth extension, they heard a loud thump and felt a vibration as the right main gear came into position. A landing gear indicator light failed to show green. The captain believed something might be wrong with the gear, and that concern quickly became his main focus. The DC-8 leveled off near 5,000 feet while the crew worked the problem. They asked air traffic control for a holding pattern south of the airport to buy time. Controllers gave them vectors and kept other traffic clear. In the cabin, the flight attendants were told there might be an issue with the gear and that the crew would be circling while they checked it. The captain wanted to be sure the airplane could land without collapsing a gear leg or sliding off the runway. He briefed the flight attendants for a possible emergency landing and asked for a cabin check to see whether anyone could see the right gear clearly through a window. None of that was unreasonable by itself. The real trouble began when the gear concern filled almost all of the captain's attention. While he flew long, looping turns in the dark over the suburbs of Portland, he kept returning to the same questions. Was the gear really locked? The first officer and flight engineer took part in those discussions, but one of them had another number in mind: fuel. Sitting at the engineer's panel, the flight engineer could see the fuel gauges steadily decreasing while they stayed in the hold, with gear and flaps extended. He began to grow uneasy. At first, he hinted at the issue, saying they were down to a certain number of pounds, and pointing out that they had already burned more than expected. As the hold dragged on, his language became more direct. He told the captain that they were reaching the minimum fuel required to land, and that they should think about heading in. The first officer, looking at his own instruments, supported that view and suggested they needed to wrap up the discussion and go back to the airport. Each time, the captain acknowledged the comments but did not change the plan. His mental priority list still had landing gear in the top slot and fuel somewhere lower down. He believed there was more time than the numbers really allowed. Having flown thousands of approaches, he may have felt that he could always squeeze in one more turn, one more briefing, one more check with the cabin before committing to final. The pressure he felt came from the gear incident, not from the fuel that was quietly being burned off with every minute in the air. Eventually, the flight engineer stopped hinting and began using words that, in modern CRM training, are supposed to trigger immediate action. He said they were reaching a fuel state that would leave very little reserve. He warned that the engines could flame out. In the cockpit, those words did not carry the weight they should have. The captain asked another question about the gear, turned again in the hold, and delayed the descent a little longer. By the time he finally told air traffic control they were ready to come in, the airplane was near the edge of what its remaining fuel could support. United 173 lined up for an approach to runway 28 left. The descent at first looked normal. Then, with only a few miles left to go, the first engine began to spool down. An alarm sounded. The crew suddenly realized that the fuel they had been talking about in the abstract was now gone in a very concrete way. Within seconds, a second engine quit. The captain pushed the nose down to try to stretch the glide, but the DC-8, heavy and low, no longer had the power to stay in the air all the way to the runway. It descended over a residential neighborhood just east of the airport, clipped treetops, and crashed into a wooded area and backyards. The impact broke the airplane into sections. Fires started in the wreckage and in nearby houses. Of the 189 people on board, 10 died, including the flight engineer, and many others were injured. The crash site lay only a few miles short of the airport. On a fuel chart, the difference between a safe landing and a crash in that neighborhood added up to just a few minutes of extra holding. The landing gear, which had caused so much concern, was later found to have been down and locked. The right gear had extended hard enough to jolt the airframe, and the indication light malfunctioned, but the basic structure was intact. The emergency they had spent so much time preparing for never actually materialized. The emergency they did not fully respect, fuel exhaustion, is the one that brought them down. Investigators concluded that the primary cause of the accident was the captain's failure to properly monitor the fuel state and respond to the crew's repeated advisories about the low fuel level, combined with an excessive focus on the abnormal gear indication. They also noted that the first officer and flight engineer did not assert themselves strongly enough when it became clear the captain was not reacting, and that United's culture at the time did not give them strong tools to override a senior captain's judgment. Those findings became one of the foundations for what the industry now calls crew resource management. In the years after Flight 173, airlines around the world began teaching pilots not just how to fly airplanes, but how to speak up, how to listen, and how to make sure that one person's fixation does not quietly drag an entire crew and an entire airplane past the point of no return. Air India Express Flight 812 departed Dubai just after 1 in the morning on May 22, 2010, bound for Mangalore on India's southwestern coast. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, a special variant equipped with a short-field performance package, designed specifically for airports with challenging runways. In the left seat was Captain Zlatko Glušica, 55 years old, a Serbian national with over 10,000 flight hours. In the right seat was First Officer Harbinder Singh Ahluwalia, 40 years old. Both men were based in Mangalore and knew the airport well. The captain had landed there 16 times. They knew what they were dealing with. Mangalore Airport sits on top of a plateau, surrounded by hills. The runway is carved into the terrain, and beyond its edges, the ground drops away sharply, 200 feet or more into the valley below. India's Aviation Authority classified it as a critical airfield, meaning only captains were permitted to perform takeoffs and landings there. There was no room for error. A pilot who overran the runway would not slide into grass or sand. He would fall off a cliff. The flight from Dubai was uneventful. Captain Glušica, who had just returned from 2 weeks of leave in Serbia, fell asleep during cruise. This was not unusual on overnight flights, and controlled rest in the cockpit is permitted under certain conditions. But what followed was not controlled rest. The captain slept for nearly 100 minutes straight. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of deep breathing, snoring, and occasional coughing. First Officer Ahluwalia monitored the aircraft alone. At 5:32 in the morning, with the aircraft approaching Indian airspace, Ahluwalia contacted Mangalore Air Traffic Control. He learned that the airport's radar had been out of service for 2 days due to a mechanical failure. This meant the normal descent profile would be different. Instead of beginning their descent far from the airport, they would start later and closer. After receiving the information, Ahluwalia woke the captain and briefed him. Glušica put on his headset and took control of the aircraft, still groggy from sleep. What happened next was a cascade of errors. The aircraft was too high. At 10 miles from the runway, they should have been at around 2,500 feet. Instead, they were at nearly 4,400 feet, almost twice the correct altitude. Rather than enter a holding pattern or request a different approach, Captain Glušića pushed the nose down and tried to salvage the approach. The descent rate climbed to nearly 4,000 feet per minute. The aircraft was falling out of the sky. First Officer Ahluwalia saw the danger clearly. At 2.5 miles from the runway threshold, he made his first call. "Go around, Captain." The captain did not respond. The ground proximity warning system began sounding. "Sink rate, pull up." Ahluwalia called again. No response. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at 200 feet altitude and over 160 knots, far above the target of 50 feet and 144 knots. Ahluwalia made his third and final call. "Go around, Captain. We don't have runway left." The captain did not go around. He continued the landing. The Boeing touched down 5,200 feet beyond the threshold, with less than 2,800 feet of runway remaining. At this point, the situation was still survivable. Boeing later conducted simulations and concluded that if the captain had applied maximum braking immediately upon touchdown, the aircraft would have stopped within the paved surface. The runway was 8,000 feet long. There was just enough room. But Captain Glušića did not commit to the landing. He deployed the thrust reversers, began braking, and then inexplicably changed his mind. With 2/3 of the runway already behind him and the aircraft still traveling at high speed, he pushed the throttles forward and attempted to take off again. It was far too late. There was no runway left. There was no altitude to gain. There was only the edge of the cliff. The last words captured on the cockpit voice recorder were spoken by one of the pilots. "Oh my God!" The Boeing 737 overran the runway, struck the localizer antenna, crashed through the perimeter fence, and tumbled down the hillside. It broke apart on impact and caught fire. Airport rescue vehicles took several minutes to reach the wreckage because the access road was narrow and uneven. By the time they arrived, the fire had consumed most of the fuselage. Of the 166 people on board, 158 were killed. Most died not from the impact, but from the flames. The investigation placed primary blame on Captain Glušića. He had continued an unstabilized approach despite multiple warnings from his first officer and from the aircraft's safety systems. Sleep inertia, the cognitive impairment that occurs immediately after waking, likely degraded his judgment and decision-making. But the report also faulted First Officer Ahluwalia. Company policy stated that a first officer must take control of the aircraft if the captain ignores repeated go-around calls. Ahluwalia had called for a go-around 3 times. He never took control. The cockpit voice recorder captured one final detail. When First Officer Ahluwalia made his last go-around call, he accidentally transmitted it on the air traffic control frequency. Controllers on the ground heard his voice. "Go around, Captain." Seconds later, they heard him scream a single word: "Control!" as the aircraft left the runway. It was a plea to a captain who was no longer listening. 6 seconds. That is how long it took between the moment the first officer finally said, "Let's make a missed approach," and the moment the Boeing 747 slammed into Nimitz Hill. 6 seconds, after an entire approach during which the crew knew something was wrong, during which the flight engineer questioned the glide slope, during which the ground proximity warning system screamed at them to pull up. For nearly 3 minutes, 2 trained pilots sat in silence while their captain flew them into a hillside. Korean Air Flight 801 departed Seoul on the evening of August 5, 1997, bound for Guam. It was a Boeing 747 carrying 254 people. In the cockpit sat Captain Park Yong-chul, a veteran pilot with nearly 9,000 flight hours, who had recently received a safety award for handling an engine failure at low altitude. The first officer was Song Kyung-ho. The flight engineer was Nam Suk-hoon. Captain Park was exhausted. 10 days earlier, he had been diagnosed with bronchitis. 3 days before the accident, he had flown a disrupted round trip to Hong Kong that left him with little sleep. On the day of departure, he woke at 6 in the morning and took only a brief midday nap. By the time the aircraft approached Guam at 1 in the morning local time, he had been awake for nearly 20 hours. The cockpit voice recorder captured him saying during descent, really sleepy." The weather in Guam was poor. Heavy rain reduced visibility, and the crew would need to rely on instruments. But there was a critical problem. The glide slope component of the instrument landing system was out of service. Without it, the approach required pilots to use a series of step-down altitudes and carefully cross-check their position. It demanded more attention and more communication. Captain Park briefed none of this to his crew. As the aircraft descended, confusion spread in the cockpit. The captain believed the glide slope was working. The flight engineer asked, "Is the glide slope working?" Captain Park answered, "Yes, yes, it's working." Seconds later, the first officer said quietly, "Not usable." An unidentified voice added, "Glide slope is incorrect." But no one pressed the issue. No one insisted. No one said, "Captain, we need to stop and figure this out." This was not an accident of mechanical failure. It was an accident of culture. In Korean society of that era, hierarchy was absolute. Subordinates did not openly challenge superiors, not in business, not in family life, and not in the cockpit. Korean Air's Crew Resource Management Program had attempted to address this by encouraging first officers to speak up. But changing a centuries-old cultural norm takes more than a training seminar. On Flight 801, the first officer and flight engineer expressed doubt in soft, indirect ways. They hinted. They asked questions rather than made statements. What they did not do was grab the controls, override the captain, or declare in plain language, "We are too low." The aircraft continued descending toward what the captain believed was the runway. In reality, they were headed for Nimitz Hill, 3 miles short of the airport. At 1:41 in the morning, the ground proximity warning system announced 1,000 feet. Seconds later, it called 500 feet. Then came the sink rate warning. The first officer responded, "Sink rate okay." It was not okay. They were descending at 1,400 feet per minute, twice the normal rate. At 1:42 and 19 seconds, as the aircraft descended through 730 feet, the flight engineer finally said, 200. The first officer added, "Let's make a missed approach." 1 second later, "Not in sight, missed approach." The flight engineer said, "Go around." The captain echoed, "Go around." It was too late. At 1:42 and 26 seconds, the Boeing 747 struck trees on Nimitz Hill, hit an oil pipeline, and slammed into the hillside at 156 knots. The impact tore the aircraft apart. Fuel ignited. Of the 254 people on board, 228 died. The NTSB investigation placed primary blame on Captain Park's failure to properly execute the approach. But the report was equally critical of the first officer and flight engineer for failing to challenge the captain's errors. They had multiple opportunities to intervene. They had the ability to take control. They had the training to speak up, and yet they remained passive until the final seconds, when intervention was no longer possible. Investigators noted that problems associated with subordinate officers challenging a captain are well known, and that Korean Air's cockpit culture reflected broader hierarchical dynamics in Korean society. The first officer had seen the danger. The flight engineer had questioned the glide slope. Neither man translated his concern into action. They deferred to the captain's authority, an authority that was leading them into a mountain. The cockpit voice recorder revealed something investigators had rarely heard before. For nearly an hour, a captain systematically dismantled his first officer's confidence, questioning his knowledge, mocking his answers, speaking to him in what the official report described as harsh and snobbish tones. By the time the aircraft began its approach into Islamabad, the first officer had been reduced to silence. He would not challenge the captain again until it was far too late. Airblue Flight 202 departed Karachi on the morning of July 28, 2010, bound for Islamabad. The aircraft was an Airbus A321, carrying 146 passengers and 6 crew members. In the left seat was Captain Pervez Iqbal Chaudhry, 61 years old, with over 25,000 flight hours. He had retired from Pakistan International Airlines at age 60, and then joined Airblue. In the right seat was First Officer Muntajib Ahmed, 34 years old, a former F-16 fighter pilot in the Pakistan Air Force with less than 2,000 hours total, and only 286 on the Airbus. The flight north was uneventful in terms of weather and mechanics, but inside the cockpit, something else was happening. Captain Chaudhry began testing his first officer's knowledge of the aircraft systems. The questions were not collaborative, the tone was not instructional. According to the investigation, the captain spent the first hour of the flight belittling Ahmed, criticizing his answers, and establishing a clear message. "I am in charge, and you are not my equal." By the time they reached the Islamabad area, the damage was done. First Officer Ahmed had effectively withdrawn from meaningful participation. He would still speak when spoken to. He would still read checklists. But the confidence to challenge, to question, to say, "Captain, I think we need to go around," that had been stripped away. The weather in Islamabad was poor. Heavy monsoon rains had been falling across Pakistan for days. Clouds hung low over the Margala Hills north of the airport. Visibility was marginal. Another flight, from China Southern, had already abandoned its approach and returned to China. But a Pakistan International Airlines flight had just landed successfully, and PIA was Airblue's main competitor. Captain Chaudhry was determined to land. The standard procedure for runway 12 at Islamabad required aircraft to remain within 5 nautical miles of the airport while circling to land. The Margala Hills rise steeply just beyond that boundary. Stay inside the circle and you stay safe. Fly outside it and you fly into terrain. Captain Chaudhry flew outside it. He requested an unconventional right-hand approach, which air traffic control denied twice. He then attempted a left-hand circuit that took the aircraft far north of the protected airspace. At one point, the controller suggested he enter a holding pattern and wait for better weather. The captain's response, recorded on the voice recorder, was dismissive. Let him say what he wants to say. First Officer Ahmed said almost nothing. As the aircraft flew north, it descended below the minimum safe altitude of 2,510 feet. The captain had programmed unauthorized waypoints into the flight management system without telling his first officer. He was flying an approach that existed only in his own head, one that took the aircraft directly toward rising terrain. Just before 20 minutes to 10 in the morning, the first ground proximity warning sounded. Terrain ahead. First Officer Ahmed finally spoke. "Sir, higher ground has reached. Sir, there is terrain ahead. Sir, turn left." But the captain did not turn left. He had become, in the words of the report, jittery, frustrated, and confused. He tried to change the heading using the autopilot, but in his panic, he rotated the heading knob without pulling it to activate the new setting. The aircraft continued straight. The tower asked if they were visual with the ground. Ahmed turned to the captain and asked, "What should I tell him, sir?" He could not even answer a simple radio call without permission. They told the tower they were visual. They were not. More warnings followed. "Terrain ahead, pull up." 21 warnings in total. The captain ignored every one of them. At 20 minutes to 10, First Officer Ahmed made one last attempt. "Sir, we are going down." "Sir." The recording ended. The Airbus struck the Margala Hills at an elevation of 2,858 feet, in a steep left bank with a descent rate exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. All 152 people on board were killed instantly. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in Pakistan's history. The investigation classified the crash as controlled flight into terrain. The primary cause was the captain's decision to fly an unauthorized approach in poor visibility while ignoring multiple terrain warnings. But the report went further. It specifically identified the captain's behavior toward his first officer as a contributing factor. His arrogant demeanor, his harsh and snobbish tone during the first hour of flight had created what investigators called a toxic work environment. First Officer Ahmed had been psychologically neutralized. When the moment came to challenge the captain's fatal decisions, he could not do it. "Negative, sir, we are comfortable. We can make it, inshallah." These were the words of Captain Sajjad Gul to air traffic control as Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 descended toward Karachi at more than twice the safe altitude. The controller had offered him a chance to circle the airport to correct the dangerous approach, but the captain refused. Moments later, the cockpit voice recorder captured him boasting to his first officer, "He will be surprised at what we have done." He was talking about the controller, expecting to impress him. Instead, within minutes, 97 people would be dead. The flight had departed Lahore on the afternoon of May 22, 2020, for a routine 90-minute trip. In the cockpit were Captain Gul, a senior pilot with over 17,000 hours, and First Officer Usman Azam. While the flight seemed normal from the outside, the pilots were dangerously distracted. For much of the trip, they engaged in casual conversation about the COVID-19 pandemic and their families. ignoring standard callouts and crew resource management protocols. Both were fasting for Ramadan, and investigators later suggested that dehydration might have impaired their judgment. As they neared Karachi, the situation deteriorated. At 15 nautical miles out, the Airbus A320 was at 9,000 feet, 3 times higher than it should have been. The captain had forgotten a programmed holding pattern. Rather than admitting the mistake and circling, he pushed the nose down, attempting a dive that exceeded 4,000 feet per minute. The cockpit became a chaotic scene of blaring alarms, overspeed warnings, ground proximity alerts, and configuration warnings. The crew silenced or ignored them all. It was during this chaotic dive that the controller saw the danger and offered the orbit. Captain Gul rejected it with his now infamous claim that they were comfortable. Then, at 1,740 feet, a completely inexplicable error occurred. First Officer Azam raised the landing gear. The aircraft was now diving toward the runway with its wheels up, flaps incorrectly set, and speed far too high. Neither pilot seemingly noticed the gear was retracted, and neither called for the mandatory go-around. The A320 crossed the threshold and slammed onto runway on its belly. The engines ground against the concrete, carving gouges into the surface and sending sparks flying. It was only after this violent impact that the captain initiated a go-around. The plane lifted off again, but the damage was already fatal. The engines, wrecked by the concrete, began to fail. As the crew struggled to climb and position for a second attempt, both engines lost power and the generators went offline. Pakistan 8303, you are losing altitude, the controller warned. Mayday, Captain Gul replied. The aircraft crashed into the densely populated model colony neighborhood less than a kilometer from the runway. Only 2 passengers survived the impact. The subsequent investigation uncovered rot within the airline's culture. It was revealed that Captain Gul had a history of unstable approaches that had gone uncorrected. Even more shocking, the aviation minister disclosed that nearly 40% of Pakistani pilots held fraudulent or dubious licenses, leading to an immediate ban of the airline from European airspace. The disaster was not just about a single bad landing. It was the result of a system where procedures were ignored, oversight was non-existent, and a captain felt comfortable boasting about breaking the rules while carrying 99 lives. Most of the flights in this video did not begin as emergencies. They were ordinary legs on familiar routes, flown by experienced crews in airplanes that were working normally. The weather was often challenging, but not extreme. The systems were available. The procedures were written. What turned them into accidents was what happened in the moments when something started to go wrong, and pride, habit, or deference got in the way of a simple decision to stop. Across these stories, the pattern repeats. A captain who is tired or overconfident presses on with a bad approach. A first officer sees the numbers drifting out of limits and asks for a go-around, then asks again, but never takes control. A flight engineer calls out fuel, attitude, or bank angle, and cannot make it the top priority in the mind of the person flying. The technology is different in each case. The details of the approach change, but the core problem is the same. One person's judgment quietly outweighs the warnings coming from both the airplane and the rest of the crew. A modern airliner has many layers of protection, checklists, automation, terrain warnings, performance margins, alternates, and diversions. None of them work if the people in the cockpit cannot say, "Go around," "We are not taking off," or "My controls," when they need to. The lesson from Tenerife, Islamabad, Yogyakarta, Mangalore, Karachi, Guam, Stansted, Washington, Siberia, and Portland is not that captains are villains and first officers are heroes. It is that hierarchy, culture, and ego can either support safety or quietly erode it until nothing is left. In the years since these accidents, airlines have changed how they train crews, how they talk about authority, and how they expect pilots to challenge each other. Crew resource management is not a buzzword. It is the idea that no one in a cockpit is above the checklist, and no one is below the right to say stop. When it works, flights with bad weather, minor malfunctions, or unstable approaches end with a routine go-around and an uneventful landing somewhere else. The kind of flight that never appears in a documentary. If you want to keep exploring how real flights go wrong and how the industry tries to make them go right, You can subscribe to Terra Obscura, leave a like, and tell me which incident, airline, or era you want to see next. The more people understand these stories, the more pressure there is on regulators, companies, and crews to keep ego out of the cockpit and let procedures, teamwork, and humility do their job.